All right. Well, Numbers 28 is where we're at, and I changed the drawing. We have a different drawing, and it's because we're really moving forward today. So this was a drawing that I used not to talk about the law and Sinai and before and after, but just for the book of Numbers. So maybe I'll put that up here. We looked at this when we were just in these chapters right here. And, but Numbers, that's its boring name. What's its cool name? The Hebrew tradition, you remember? In the wilderness, in the wilderness. Or in Hebrew, Bamidbar. And that's because the shape of just Numbers itself takes place in 3 stages in the wilderness. So the first chapters at Sinai were 1 through 10 in the wilderness around Sinai. And then they move out towards Kadesh. Oh yeah, I'll get the map that we've been looking at here. There it is. So Sinai is somewhere down here, and then Kadesh is located in this region around Kadesh Barnea right here. That's the town's full name. And so they wander up here from Sinai, and then here, if you remember, is where they launched the spies to go up into the land of Canaan proper. And so all of their wandering, then the 40 years, all took place in this region right around here. That's Kadesh. And this was the sad part of the book. And then at the end of chapter 21, after the strange story about the snake on the pole, it's a weird one, they move forward into the region of Moab, which is this upper region right across from the land of Canaan itself. And this is modern day, like Jordan, and so on. So that's where they are. That's where they are right now. So 3 regions of the wilderness: Sinai, Kadesh, and Moab. And so who are the people standing? Who are the Israelites standing right here? What generation are we talking about at this point? First or second generation now. So that's really important. So these were kind of like the sordid tales of the Exodus generation. And now they all have died, and the culmination of that tragedy was actually kind of carried forward into this story. After this was the Balaam stories right here, which were exciting and crazy and amazing, and then we had the story of the Israelites fully intermarrying with and beginning to worship the Canaanite gods as they integrated with these Canaanites here. And that was the last sad story of the Exodus generation. So now we're on the brink of a new generation and of a new day. So look at chapter 28. We left through, let's just go back to 26 with me. So you have the new generation. What happened? What's the first thing they basically do after the Exodus generation dies off completely? Chapter 26. So new numbering of the people, right? So that we have that's in 26. So that repeats what happened back here at the beginning of Numbers. If you look at 27, then there was that story we read last week about this group of women, the daughters of Zelophehad. They don't have any brothers. Their father died in the Exodus generation. What's the status of their inheritance? So that's all raised by new generation stuff. Look at verse 12 and following. Moses is going to die off as part of the Exodus generation, and so Joshua is going to succeed. Do you see how we're setting the story up here for the new generation? Okay. So if you look at chapter 28, which is where we're picking up today, and does anyone have chapter titles? What do you see there? Daily offerings. You're like, I just want to go back to bed. So it's okay. And actually, look at there's daily offerings. Go down to verse 9. What's that section about? Sabbath, how often do those take place? Week. So you daily offerings, weekly offerings. Look at verse 11. What's the next category? Monthly offerings. And at least in the Old Testament, the months are marked by the moon. They had a lunar calendar. They did not have a solar calendar like we have. They had a lunar calendar. So new moon every month. And then verse 16, what annual sacrifices are we talking about in verse 16 and forward? Passover. Okay. Look at verse 26. What other annual feast are we talking about there? Feast of Weeks, which goes by lots of different names. Feast of Weeks, it's 50 days after Passover. It's also called First Fruits or Pentecost. Chapter 29, verse 1. What feast? What feast are we talking about here? The Feast of Trumpets. Yep, thank you. Which becomes, later in Jewish tradition, became Rosh Hashanah, or Rosh Hashanah, if you know that one, the New Year. Look at verse 7, 29, verse 7. What annual feast are we talking about here? The Day of Atonement. And then look at verse 12. What annual feast are we talking about starting there? The Feast of Tabernacle or Sukkot. Now, what these two chapters do is basically pick up Leviticus 23 and just kind of recycle it. It's recycling. It's very efficient use, or non-efficient use, because it took about 4 pages that maybe didn't need to be there if they would just go back and read Leviticus 23. But Leviticus didn't probably exist in the form that we have it yet. So can you think of why you would need a repetition of what offerings are to be made on these days in terms of the flow of the narrative? It's the new generation, right? They're receiving new instruction. And so this happens quite a lot, actually, in the book of Numbers. It's going to happen again in the book of Deuteronomy. In the book of Deuteronomy, we're going to explore again many of the laws that we already heard of in Leviticus, in the book of Leviticus, in early chapters of Numbers, but with interesting differences. So that will be Deuteronomy. So that's about all I have to say about Numbers 28 and 29, because we covered that in detail when we did the offerings in Leviticus and so on. So there you go. I'm happy to talk about those chapters with anyone who wants to talk about that afterwards. Look at chapter 30. This is actually a real similar kind of thing. Chapter heading, anybody? What are we talking about? Vows. Yes, yeah, vows. So, so we'll just take a moment here, because really I want to get to 31, and actually I don't really want to get to 31, because we're talking about holy war today, but I want to get there to spend our time there. So vows, I'll just, we don't have this, or maybe we do this. Let me show you. Let me show you an example of someone making a vow and what this whole practice is about. So this is the story about Jacob, and this is when Jacob's fleeing. He stole the birthright from his brother. And when did we talk about this? This would have been like March of 2013 or something like that. So anyway, he stole the inheritance birthright from his brother, Esau's brother wants to kill him, so he's got to flee. And so he leaves his homeland, and this is what he says. When he leaves the land, it says, Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me, if he keeps me safe on this journey that I take and gives me food to eat and garments to wear, and if I end up returning to my father's house in safety, then Yahweh will be my God. And this stone, which I have set up as a pillar, will be God's house, and of all that you give me, when I return back here, I'll give 1/10 to you. Now, that's kind of a gutsy vow, because it's sort of like, well, Yahweh, maybe you're my God. If you give me the bennies, right? If you give me the benefits and make life work out for me, then you'll be my God. And this fits into the whole thing of how Jacob's a really horrible person and always trying to manipulate God. But the whole point right here is just a vow. This is how vows work. Whenever you see vows referred to in the Old Testament, this is the type of thing. It's a prayer to God, Lord, if this works out, if I get out of this situation, if, I'm praying for this job, if you could give me this job, then I vow that I will make this many offerings, give 2 bowls or something like that. That's what vows refer to here. And it was a super common practice. And the book of Ecclesiastes has a warning against not making hasty vows, because you will be held accountable for your vows. And then there developed this practice on top of this of trying to one-up each other on the intensity of your vows. And so you would make a vow in the name of Yahweh, or do you know this passage that I'm talking about in Jesus talks about this practice, and he's like, this is really screwed up. Matthew, it's at the end of 5. Here we go. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, again, you have heard that the ancients were told, don't make false vows, but fulfill your vows to Yahweh. But I say to you, just don't make vows at all, whether it's by heaven, or whether it's by the throne of God, or whether it's by earth, it's the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, it's the city of the great king. So what he's referring to right here is people started making vows, not just to say, if God does this, I'll do this, but they say, if God does this, then I swear by the city of Jerusalem that I will repay my vow. It's sort of like, well, why don't just say that you're going to do it? Like, why do you have to bring Jerusalem into it? If God, gives us a good harvest this year, then I swear by heaven, or I swear by earth, or by Jerusalem, and so on. And so it was this way of using Yahweh or things connected with Yahweh, the temple or Jerusalem, as just essentially trying to dress up your own status in the eyes of people that you're making vows in front of. And Jesus is like, quit it, dude. Like, no one's impressed by your fancy vow. Like, just do what you say you're going to do. And if you make a promise to God, then keep it. Let your yes be yes, and let your no be no. Anything beyond this is just you being a screwed up person. So this is what Jesus is getting at here. He's talking about so it's not that the vows are bad, it's that vows turned into a religious kind of status positioning in how they talked about vows. I just need to think about it. If I was doing a sermon on this, I would sit down and I would think about the ways that we do this in our Facebook. I don't know. It's about posturing. It's public posturing to make yourself look better and more impressive than you actually are. That's essentially what Jesus is getting at here. Who uses Facebook anymore? Anybody? Anyway, who has time? Anyway, so Numbers chapter 30 is all about vows. And actually, this is another recycling because the first big statement about vows was in Leviticus chapter 27. So in many ways, this is recycling a lot of what was already said in Leviticus 27 for the wilderness, for the second generation right here. There are some new bits here, but I would rather move on to chapter 31 and tackle the dragon that we haven't had to tackle yet. You guys okay with that? Okay, good. Let's just read Numbers 31. We've come across a few skirmishes with the Canaanites already here. They ended up in a battle with the king of Arad, with the king called Og and Bashan. But these were all battles that is, Israel was kind of wandering through. They don't have a standing army. They took a census of who can fight, but they don't have a standing army. They don't have tons of weapons and stuff like that. They're still, escaped refugees, from Egypt, essentially. And so these nations pounce on them, thinking that it's easy plunder or something like that, and Yahweh delivers them. What's new in chapter 31 is this is the first time that Israel is called by God to go on the offensive against a Canaanite people group. And it's not the last time that it's going to happen. But it is the first, and so because we're moving into this territory, I want to just kind of set the playing field for how to read these stories and how to let them bother you, which is okay, because they are bothersome, but also some ways to think about them as Christians. So that's chapter 31. So Yahweh said to Moses, "Take vengeance on the Midianites for or on behalf of the Israelites. And after that, Moses, you will be gathered to your people." Gathered to your people, it's a little biblical phrase that means die and be buried in the family tomb. So Moses said to the people, "Arm some of your men to go to war against the Midianites and carry out the Lord's vengeance, or Yahweh's vengeance on them." Now, let's just pause real quick here. What Midianites, what did they do? We're responding or reacting to something that's already taken place. Right, so we go back to chapter 25. So that whole story of right after the Balaam stories and Yahweh turned the king of Moab's curse into a blessing, they end up replaying the golden calf story, which we talked about in chapter 25. So, who was, do you remember, go down to verse 6. You remember there was that Israelite man, we talked about this last week, and he brought a certain woman who was the daughter of one of the chiefs of what tribe of people? Look down to verse 6. An Israelite brought to his family a Midianite woman, and then you find out in chapter 25, down in verse 15, that the name of the Midianite woman who was killed by Phinehas and Nazil was Kovzi, the daughter of Zur, a tribal chief of the Midianite family. And so, and then verse 16, Yahweh said to Moses, "Treat the Midianites as enemies and kill them because they treated you as enemies and deceived you in the affair of Peor." So that's what all this is coming from, is in chapter 25. We're told that this group of people intentionally tried to integrate and to convert, intermarry with Israel, and to get them to follow their gods. And so that's back to chapter 31. That's what's going on here. Now, when you heard the word vengeance, is there any positive way you can spin that word in English? In English. When you hear the word vengeance, what do you think of? Revenge, okay? So, and in English, revenge is revenge usually pure justice when we think of revenge in English? No, it's like justice plus a little more. It's like you stole my cookie, so I'm going to get one cookie back and spray paint your car or something like that. Like it's the personal edge to it. So just I just came up with that. That was quite clever. So, we think of that's revenge. So, vengeance in the Bible, when people do it, it can have that edge. But there's this big theme. It's a famous theme. Paul the Apostle even quotes it when he says, "Don't repay evil for evil." Why? Paul says, "Don't get back when people do wrong to you, and you're a Christian. Don't get back at them." Why? Paul says. He quotes Deuteronomy, where Yahweh says, "Vengeance belongs to me, not to you, to me." And so this is a big theme where Yahweh, and when it's Yahweh, it's not like he's just being spiteful. It's the idea of that true justice and recompense can only be purely dealt with or dealt out or repaid by someone who actually doesn't have that personal edge in the game, so to speak. And that's Yahweh. He's the just judge. And so when you see this word, at least here in the story, the point isn't like, oh, those Midianites, The point is like, here's what the Midianites did. We're going to exact justice on them. So whatever punitive, retributive justice, it's not about a personal vendetta. That's the idea here. Not that lessens the challenge of this story for us, but it does put it in a bit of context. Okay. Verse 4, "Send into battle 1,000 men from each of the tribes of Israel." And so, 12,000 men armed for battle, 12,000 men armed for battle, 1,000 from each tribe were supplied with the clans from the clans of Israel. Moses sent them into battle, 1,000 from each tribe, along with, who should appear? Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, who was the one who in his zeal was the one Israelite who brought Yahweh's vengeance on the Midianite woman and her husband and so on in chapter 25. So he's the priest heading the charge here. And he took with him articles from the sanctuary and trumpets for signaling. Remember those trumpets? We talked about those trumpets earlier on for war. It was chapter 7, anyway. They fought against Midian as Yahweh commanded Moses, and they killed every man. Among their victims were Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, Reva, the 5 kings of Midian, and who also got killed in this battle. Balaam. They also killed Balaam, son of Beor. The Israelites captured the Midianite women and children and took the Midianite herds and flocks and goods as plunder. They burned the towns where the Midianites settled, as well as their camps. They took all the plunder and spoils, including people and animals. They brought the captives, the spoils, the plunder to Moses and Eleazar the priest and the Israelite assembly at their camp in the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from the Jericho. So let's just pause real quick here. So there were 5 kings of Midian, and we're told that they killed everybody among the enemies. Now there's a bit of a puzzle here because the Midianites are not wiped off the map here by any means. They totally continue to exist, and they appear in quite a few other stories. There was one famous story, the guy Gideon. Remember Gideon, and he has to trim down the army and so on. That's entirely against the Midianites. So the Midianites, as you trace their story through, they're not a nation as such. They don't have a land. There's just a few times they're depicted, but they're mostly more nomadic, seasonal, migrating network of tribes. And so whoever they're dealing with right here, it was the group of tribes that lived in this region of Moab and that tried to get them to intermingle and stuff like that. And so it's one arm or one network of the tribes of Midian because they still exist as the story goes on. So you get the story here. It's an overwhelming victory for Israel. They are able to kill the military leaders and so on, and then they have all this plunder: women, children, animals. Verse 13. Now Moses, Eleazar the priest, and all the leaders of the community went out to meet them outside the camp. Moses was angry with the officers of the army, the commanders of thousands and the commanders of hundreds who returned from the battle. "Have you allowed all of the women to live?" he asked them. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice, and they were the means of turning the Israelites away from Yahweh, back at what happened at Peor, so that a plague ended up striking Yahweh's people. So now, kill all of the boys. Kill every woman who slept with a man, i.e., connected to the Peor incident, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. Verse 19, we'll talk about this. All of you who have killed anyone or touched anyone who was killed must stay outside the camp for 7 days. On the 3rd and 7th days, you must purify yourselves and your captives, purify every garment, as well as everything made of leather, goat hair, or wood. So Eleazar the priest, we're just going to finish through the chapter and reflect. Eleazar the priest said to the soldiers who had gone into battle, "Here's the requirement of the law that Yahweh gave Moses: gold, silver, bronze, iron, tin, lead, anything else that can withstand fire must be put through the fire, and then it will be clean. But it must also be purified with water of cleansing, and whatever cannot withstand fire must be put through water. And on the 7th day, wash your clothes, and you'll be clean. Then you may come into the camp." So you have both this victory, and then you have what we're going to see, the slaughter, I think it's the appropriate word, of these other Midianites is a part of this ritual activity of purification. So in other words, we can frame it as whatever different ways you want. The story's framing it in terms of purification. It's as if the Midianites brought Israel into deep moral and ritual impurity, and so both the putting to death, but then also all of the plunder that they have. It's not that they just score, they get all this stuff. They actually have to burn it all down and to wash it all. It's a part of this ritual cleansing of the materials. Verse 25. So Yahweh said to Moses, "You and Eleazar the priest and the family heads of the community are to count all of the people and all of the animals that were captured. Divide the spoils between the soldiers who took part in the battle and between the rest of the community of Israel," like the 12,000 who. So you have the 12,000 who fought, and then the rest of the people who didn't. "And from the soldiers who fought in the battle, set apart as tribute for Yahweh 1 out of every 500, whether it's persons, cattle, donkeys, sheep, goats. Take this tribute from their half, share and give it to Eleazar the priest as Yahweh's part. But from the larger Israelites' half, select 1 out of every 50, persons, cattle, donkeys, sheep, goats, other animals. Give them to the Levites, who are responsible for the care of Yahweh's tabernacle." And so Moses and Eleazar did as Yahweh commanded them. And then you can see the numbers of what they do. So they take all of the remaining animals and loot, and then also the women that were left, and they divide them up half, and then each of those halves, certain points, are divided out, some for the priests and some to work in the tabernacle. So here's the point, at least it seems to me. The point is that when Israel is fighting a war that's a part of Yahweh bringing his justice on another nation, this isn't just about God being pro-Israel. And this isn't about Israel just getting to loot everything. Everything has to be purified, and even then, the people of Israel don't get all of that. What happens is it's as if there's a tithe, as it were, and some of it is tithed to the priest, and they serve with the priest, and some of it is tithed to the temple, and so on. And so even people, look down at verse 40. So there's apparently 16,000 people, of which the tribute to Yahweh was 32. That's one out of every 500. And so these are people who now are going to go be working in facilities and maintenance in the tabernacle and in the temple. Verse 48. So then they divide up all the stuff. Then the officers who were over the units of the army, the commanders of the thousands, commanders of hundreds, they went to Moses and said, "Your servants have counted the soldiers under our command. Not one is missing." Now, so stop. They sent 12,000 soldiers to battle. They came back, all the plunder, all the dividing up and so on. And how many Israelites soldiers died? Apparently 0. That's remarkable. It's remarkable. And that's an important theme to remember here. So we brought as an offering to Yahweh the gold articles each of us acquired, all these different rings and bracelets and earrings and necklaces, to make atonement for ourselves before Yahweh. It's another one of these few instances where they're making atonement without means of blood sacrifice. So Moses and Eleazar the priests accepted from them the gold, the crafted articles, the gold from the commanders of thousands, the commanders of hundreds that Moses and Eleazar presented as a gift to Yahweh, weighed 16,750 shekels, 420 pounds. Each soldier had taken plunder for himself. Moses and Eleazar accepted the gold from the commanders of thousands, the commanders of hundreds. They brought it to the tent of meeting as a memorial offering for the Israelites before Yahweh. Numbers 31. How you guys doing? Wow. So I won't hesitate to say this is deeply like, what? What? So I just want to go read the New Testament now and act like this isn't here. So there's a number of challenges I think we have with these holy war texts, and so if anything, I kind of wanted to just share. I've outlined a few thoughts about how I've processed these passages, and I don't know what else to do. I'll also show you a really handy book, two handy books that have been helpful for me. If everything about sacrifice and slavery and holy war and all this, if really there's one place to go now. This guy, Paul Copan, did a wonderful service in assembling every possible strange, offensive, bizarre thing to Western readers of the Old Testament. And he's wrote a wonderful book called Is God a Moral Monster? Making sense of the Old Testament God. And in he has a whole section on sacrifice and covenants and so on. He has a whole stuff about the kosher laws and the food laws. He has a whole section about the capital punishment, the death penalty, the status of women in Old Testament Israel, marriage in the Old Testament. He has 3 chapters on slavery, and then 3 chapters on holy war in the Old Testament. It is really, and he's really going for it. It's a scholarly treatment, and he's really trying to help Christians process through all of this type of stuff. And then he ends with some broader reflections on the whole concept of morality in these stories. It's very helpful. So a lot of my reflections are drawn from Paul Copan, but I find it really helpful. You guys doing okay? So this is kind of like a little mini power lecture or something like that, but whatever. You guys are here, you know me, whatever. So I think it's helpful to think about how Christians through history have dealt with these texts and not just dive into why this is hard for me, but actually to recognize that for 2,000 years that Christians have received the Old Testament scriptures because we follow Jesus, the Jewish Messiah. Christians have been wrestling with these texts for a long time and what to do with them. And I should make the point precise. The point is not, can God bring justice on people? The point, at least for me, what's challenging about a story like this is that God is using Israel as an instrument of his justice on other people. And that's what's challenging for me, because who's Israel? Like, who's Israel? Is Israel morally superior to be able to do this to other people? No. Now, has God played favorites? Is he doing anything to the Midianites is his justice on the Midianites anything that he hasn't already brought justice on Israel for? No, the whole generation has died off. But I think, at least for me, that's the nub of the issue here, is it's still challenging for me to think and process through God bringing his justice on people, but you have the concept of God's holiness and him being the just judge and so on. What's challenging for me is, one, God using imperfect human instruments to bring that justice. And then secondly, once women and children get brought into this, I want to crawl into a hole. I'm guessing, and so do you also. So what do you do about this? So there's a few ways that Christians have processed this, and I'll just go through this really, really briefly. So one, you could call it the new dispensation approach, which is basically God changes the rules of the game as the story of the Bible moves forward. And so Israel was a nation, a theocracy, and therefore national identity was bound up with religious identity. If that's going to be protected, Israel fights wars. That's just how Yahweh was. That was the rules of the game of the Sinai covenant. And when Jesus came, you've heard it said to you in the past, but now I say to you, it's the new covenant. And it's God's prerogative to change the rules of the game. And so we don't do it that way anymore. That's my brief summary of that approach. And it's a really common approach. The second is that Yahweh engaging and calling Israel to engage in holy war is sort of like God rolling up his sleeves and getting involved in the mess of human history. And what's Yahweh going to do? It's a bit presumptuous on our end to say God should have just dropped down, social morality as 21st century enlightened Westerners think it ought to be, brought about, and just to drop that into a culture from 3,000 years ago, because we know, of course, that we are the pinnacle of human moral development. It's that's a bit presumptuous, right? And so it's not as if people living 3,000 years ago didn't have consciences and were somehow less moral or something like that. They just had different worldviews and they thought about things differently. And so another view is that here God is accommodating to the cultural setting where killing people in this type of setting isn't viewed from a more Western individualistic mindset where the liberty and life of the individual is the highest good, but rather these are traditional cultures where the safety, the identity of the community is the highest good, and therefore human lives can be expendable if necessary to protect the identity of the group. And so this view would be that God's conceding to that brokenness in their culture, that God's accommodating to that screwed up factor. So there is precedent for this idea in Matthew 19, where Jesus is approached by some Pharisees, and they're asking him about divorce. And they say, is it legitimate for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And they can quote the Bible. In fact, they do. They end up quoting Deuteronomy 24 down here. Moses said, you can give a certificate of divorce and so on. But what does Jesus do? He doesn't appeal to the laws of the Torah. He appeals back to Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And he appeals to God's creative purpose and the purpose of marriage and what it is and so on. And so then what he goes on to say, and Jesus goes on to say, is that because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to do this, but from the beginning, this was never God's intent, and now that Jesus is here, he's come here to restore that intent. And so many people see and hear a kind of model for how to deal with Old Testament problems like this, that this was God accommodating to Israel due to the fallenness of their culture, but it was never God's ultimate purpose. In other words, God's accommodating to Israel's existence as a nation, and therefore he commands them to act like this, but this was never God's ideal. He's working with, what would you say? It's like I don't know, have you guys ever been in a situation where you have two really difficult decisions? You have a decision to make, two choices ahead of you, and they both suck. Like they're both bad decisions, but you have to make a decision, a moral decision, a relational decision, and there's no good option. There's only bad or worse, you know? And so that's kind of this view here, is that Yahweh's dealing with these people now in the wilderness. He made a promise to Abraham. He's going to follow through. And here they are now. They didn't say no to the Midianites. They said yes, and now they're all intermingled. And so what's Yahweh supposed to do? That's the idea here. This isn't his highest moral vision, but it's what happens in the circumstances. So I have to say that personally, I resonate to a large degree with that view through a lot of the Old Testament. But that's a really common view too. And I'm not saying these are all mutually exclusive. I'm saying these, I think, can overlap. A third one, this one is distinct, I think, is that God is progressively through history revealing a greater and greater and a higher vision of human ethics and morality that comes to its culmination in Jesus. And again, there's an element of truth in it, though that can be kind of dangerous too, because what Westerners have typically done with this idea, if you read like historical studies of the life of Jesus in the 1800s, what you'll find is a whole bunch of people who think Jesus was an 18th century Western European political liberal. It's really fascinating. And there was a famous book. It was just churning in all the universities and people writing books on Jesus and stuff like that. And then there was this one guy named Albert Schweitzer. I just want you to know about Albert Schweitzer because he's incredible. He wrote a book called The Quest for the Historical Jesus. Do they have the original cover? No. Man, the one I have on my bookshelf is the cover is so cool. Anyway, but it's an older cover. And he used this image. He just says most of like Western scholarship on Jesus up to this point has been like people looking at the bottom, down to the bottom of a very deep well, and they think they see someone's head down there, but actually all they're really seeing is their own reflection. And we tend to make Jesus in our own image, And the danger of this point of view is making ethics and morality as we see it to be the pinnacle. And isn't it great that God was leading all of history to lead up to the way we see things? Right? And so that's kind of the danger, I think, of this point of view. But there is an element of truth in it, in which you do have some kind of progression going on in the story. Another view that's fairly prominent is that basically the New Testament, what Jesus is coming to create a religious, spiritual community, not try and tell us how to run nations. And so violence is the threat, or at least the threat of violence is the way that law is enforced, and that's just going to be a reality until Jesus returns. And so as a Christian, you have your foot in two kingdoms. And when Israel was a national entity, they had to walk that line too. So those are all approaches that I think have strengths and weaknesses to them. But I just want you to see it's not like if you struggle with this issue, I just want you to know you're not the only one. You join 2,000 years worth of Christians who are struggling with these texts. And I just think that itself is important to recognize. At least makes you feel less crazy or something like that, or you're not being a bad Christian because you're struggling with part of the Bible. Some thoughts that have been helpful for me, and these are kind of drawn from Paul Copon. Is this okay, you guys? This is not what I normally do, but it's such a hot issue, and we're going to keep coming across it as time goes on, and so just to kind of build a foundation. So the first one, this would be a way of saying this, is that holy war is a way of Yahweh limiting violence and protecting Israel from extinction. So we also read this from the perspective of Israel later became a kingdom with a standing military and so on. But the context of the story is this is still a huge group of escaped refugees who are living on barely nothing, and they don't have a standing army. And these are the people through whom Yahweh is going to ultimately bring the Messiah in the new covenant. And so through this concept of holy war, Israel didn't go around picking fights with everybody. They did get into some wars here, but they were wars that the Canaanites started. And so there really, if you actually read through Numbers and you read through Joshua, there really aren't that many stories like this. There are some, but there's not that many. And the particular nations that Yahweh tells them to go do this with are the nations who are living in that block of land that's called the land of Canaan. And that group of people is connected to the other factors that we'll get to in a second. But really this is a way in the story, if you read them all together, it's a way of Yahweh curbing and limiting and focusing his justice on specific people groups. And there are always people groups which there's some bad connection threatening Israel's existence. So here it's nations threatening their existence because they're attacking them. Here with the Midianites, it's threatening Israel's existence by intermarriage, bringing them into the worship of other gods, and compromising their religious identity and their ethnic identity too as they assimilate. And so as hard as it is for us to see that, this is a way of Yahweh protecting Israel through focused violence. That's the best way I know how to frame that. Does that make sense? Let's see. I kind of already said the second one here. But this is significant. This was not Israel's general policy for war. I'll just throw in here Deuteronomy 20 gives you Israel's normal war policies, which was always to first pursue peace. It just says it right there in Deuteronomy 20. But then Yahweh says, but for the group of nations living within the land of Canaan, these are the ones you were to run out or to declare war on. A theme that we've already talked about is that these particular nations, the Midianites among them, it's always connected to the moral degradation of these people groups. So, the Canaanite religious practices, they're kind of notorious in the ancient Near East, specifically for child sacrifice and ritual sex, and ritual orgies and prostitution and so on, all connected with their temples. And so this is a form, the story views it as a form of divine justice. And Israel is the instrument of divine justice. But here's what's interesting, is that who was the human instrument of divine justice on Israel once they started acting the same way once they were in the land? So Assyria and Babylon. And who had a problem with that? What prophet had a real problem with Yahweh using Babylon to bring Yahweh's justice on Israel? Do you remember? It's a whole book of the prophets. So his name's Habakkuk. And he begins by saying, oh, the world's so screwed up. Israel's just horrible. And Yahweh says, exactly, I'm going to bring Babylon. And Habakkuk's like, what? No, that makes it even worse. What do you mean, Yahweh? You're going to use Babylon? They're horrible. They're horrible. And so he's struggling with this idea. And so this idea that God will use imperfect humans as instruments of his judgment, it's a theme in the Bible, and it's not only Israel, it's actually Babylon on Israel. Here's the problem, and actually here's this one, maybe I should separate out this as a separate point, I'm not sure. As I said earlier, this is really the one that personally gets me, is I have less of a problem with Yahweh personally dealing justice. I have more of a problem with him using imperfect, flawed humans as instruments of his justice. Does that make sense to anybody? Well, that's just why I have a hard time here. And specifically because, they're so screwed up, and I'm so screwed up. And because this is where I think the seed of religious violence really is potentially sown, is it's when humans get in their brain that somehow I'm God's chosen instrument to bring revelation or justice to the world, and history's filled with, individuals and megalomaniacs who think that they're God's instrument to do whatever in the world, and they're deeply deceived, and they hurt and kill a lot of people. And I think it's with the potential abuse of this theme that is, for me, what is difficult about it. So here's some thoughts, concluding thoughts here. I think when we read these stories, we can wrestle with them, but you just have to respect them. You have to respect what they mean. So these wars were always ad hoc. They were spontaneous response to threats to Israel's existence. That's what all of these wars are. In Numbers, in Joshua, and so on. Israel was barely existing at this point, and this was Yahweh's way of protecting them. Now, this is really significant. Whenever these wars are remembered or recalled as you read through the story of the Bible, whenever the Psalms, whenever the prophets look back to these holy wars, not once, this is so significant, not once is it ever used to say, look what Yahweh had us do to the Midianites, therefore let's go do that to the Babylonians. Not once. The holy wars are never used to legitimate more violence against the Canaanites. That seems like that's significant to me. It's actually just the opposite. It becomes, these are memories that when our existence as a nation is threatened, as you go on in Old Testament, that what we should first do is not build up more military, but go to the temple and pray. And so there's so many stories like this. I've just given a couple here. But I'll show you one line. This is actually where all of this begins, the first theme of this. It's where Moses and the people, they're sitting by the Red Sea. Pharaoh's armies are, closing in on them. And Moses says to the people, right at the coast of the Red Sea, he says, "Don't fear. Stand by and see the salvation of Yahweh that he'll accomplish for you today. The Egyptians whom you have seen, you'll never see them again forever." And this theme gets echoed throughout the stories of Holy War. How many Israelite soldiers died in this battle, according to Numbers chapter 31? 0. What? All of the stories of Holy War are like this. There's some remarkable event that Israel can look back on, and the point is for them to look back on and to say, like, wow, we didn't do that. Like, that was Yahweh providing and saving for us miraculously when we were on the brink of annihilation. And that's the stories of Jericho. There's always some element of Yahweh did something, this is not us. And so you get Psalms later that when they think back to this story, there'll be Psalms, like 46, not by might, not by power, not by bows, not by chariots. We just trust purely in the name of Yahweh. And so ironically, these stories didn't spur further violence. They actually called Israel to, at least the prophets thought it was to call Israel to not rely on violence, but to go to the temple and pray and wait for Yahweh to rescue you. And it seems like that's the role that these stories played, even in Jesus' day. Even I think this is the type of stories that fueled Jesus' vision of the kingdom, that instead of taking up arms, he would go retreat and pray and wait for the kingdom. He says, wait for God's kingdom to come, pray for it to come, because it's going to be God doing it, not you making it happen. So that's where these stories go theologically, and that's helpful for me. It still doesn't solve this one for me, which is really, this is the one that I wrestle with the most. But that's I'm sorry if that was boring, but I just wanted to do that because for myself only, and then I can move on from Numbers 31 in peace until we get to Joshua. So that's how I've thought through these texts. And really, I think at the end of the day, it just leaves me at the feet of Jesus and to say there are lots of things in the scriptures that bother me and that I don't understand. But I read the scriptures because they point me to Jesus. And Jesus bothers me, but in ways that are really good. And that I'm glad that he bothers me. And the type of person that he was and who he reveals God to be to us puts even these stories in a much broader context of God's covenant love for his broken world, and that he would ultimately take violence, human violence, into himself and let it kill him as a means of conquering it. So Jesus is awesome.